This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Pete McCommons, who over the last 5 decades has had the opportunity to be involved with and to observe the University of Georgia and Athens in a variety of special circumstances and from a number of unique perspectives. Pete, we're so glad you could be with us today.
I'm delighted to be here after 5 decades. I didn't realize it'd been that long.
Today is November 30th, 2012, and we're in the conference room of the Ray Nicholson House on the University of Georgia campus. Others with us today include Alice Vernon and Bill Evelyn, our videographer, members of our Going Back crew. And I am Fran Lane. Pete, let's start at the beginning. You are a Greene County, Georgia boy, right?
Greensboro, Georgia, Greene County.
Talk to us a little bit about early life growing up in Greensboro and in the 40s and 50s. What was that like?
Well, it was a small town, and Greensboro, for some reason, was not quite as country as some of the surrounding towns. I want to be tactful. But you know, a lot of the people in leadership positions in Greensboro were college graduates, and the town just had a little bit more of a cultured feel to it than, say, Eatonton or Sparta. But it was my classmates now are fixated on what a wonderful, idyllic small town life it was, and I'm sure it was in many ways, but it was a pleasant town to live in. Of course, it was strictly segregated, so when our memories of growing up in Greensboro, basically of growing up in the white community, although we had a lot of contact with the black populace who worked in our homes and our stores, but we just didn't go to school with their children. And our lives in that sense were not as rich as they could have been, but that was a fact of life at that time in the 40s and 50s.
Absolutely, all over the South.
Yeah.
You went to public schools?
Went to public school. That's all there was, black and white. And went to the Methodist Church, and all of my friends went to public school, and at that time the country kids went to schools out in the county and then came into Greensboro and joined us in the 8th grade. So prior to the 8th grade, we just had our little cohort of city kids, and then in the 8th grade we had this strong influx of country kids who added an awful lot to our lives and our schooling, and particularly to our athletic teams. They were all just tough as boards, and became the backbone of our high school football and basketball track teams. So we were glad to get that infusion from the country.
You mentioned the Methodist Church. Did everybody you know go to church?
Everybody I knew went to church, yes.
That was my experience.
Yes. The Baptists were the largest church in town, and then the Methodists and the Presbyterians. We even had a tiny, beautiful little Episcopal chapel that's still there. And some of the more eccentric citizens attended the Episcopal Church. I guess it's still that way, is it not?
I would agree.
You could cut that if you need to.
Were there any early influences on your life in Greensboro? I know there were early influences, but talk to us a little bit about who impacted your life.
Well, my parents, of course, were very serious about education and our learning how to make our way in the world, and they were, without my realizing it, a liberalizing influence. They were concerned about the community and were active in the church. My mother more than my father, though he did his stint as chairman of the Board of Stewards. And so we, we were cautioned at home to respect other people regardless of their color, and to work hard and to study, to make good grades, and those influences.
You had siblings?
I had two sisters, one a year older and one 2.5 years older. So we were close in school, and
you were well looked after then.
I was. I never had to iron a shirt.
How and when did Roland Merritt McCommons Jr. become Pete?
Well, instantly. When I was born, I was named for my father, and my mother raised the question with him of, will it not create confusion when I say Rollin and you don't know who I'm talking to? And he said, well, let's just call him Pete for a while. So now these 72 years later, I'm still Pete.
Pete at birth?
Yes.
Okay. So you continued and finished at Greene County High School?
Well, at that time it was Greensboro High School. It was not a countywide school. It was another high school in Union Point down the road 7 miles, and they were a rather small school. They were not large enough to have a football team, so they practiced basketball year round, and they had a killer basketball team. We were bitter rivals, and every year there were classic battles with Union Point on the basketball court. And the only way we could finally vanquish them was to take them into the high school and make it Greene County High.
What pointed you in the direction of Athens and the University of Georgia?
Well, there was not a lot of choice. Emory was very attractive to me because of my work in the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and I had worked at Camp Glisson up in North Georgia several summers, and had gotten to know a lot of cool, smart kids who were going to Emory, and but that was out of our league financially, and I finally got a General Motors scholarship to the university, which sort of ended the there was no question then, but that I would go to the university. And my father had attended the university. So even though it was 35 miles from home, it was the place to go. I would not have thought of a smaller school at that time. And of course, then anybody who wanted to could come to the University of Georgia. You just applied and were accepted, and then of course you had to make the grade. If you didn't make the grade, you flunked out, which many did, but getting in was no problem.
How times have changed.
How times have changed, indeed.
You attended the university from 1958 to 1962.
That's what I'm told, yes.
What an interesting and tumultuous time to be there.
It was indeed.
Well, we're going to get to that. Let me ask you, when you stepped foot on campus, it looked different than it does today.
It did.
Tell us about physically how it looked. Can you remember?
Well, it might be best to think in terms of what was not here at that time. And of course, there were no computers. We didn't have computers. There may have been some in the business office at the university at that time, but not many, and they were large and difficult to operate. So all of our note-taking and communication was with a pen and pencil and paper. And the Science Center was being constructed when I was a freshman. I lived in Reed Hall, and over past the stadium there was all kinds of construction going on because they had begun to build a Science Center. And my recollection is that the university was 5,500 at that time. I may be a little off. It may have been in the 7,000 range, but much, much smaller. And to register for classes, one had to show up at Stegman Hall on the appointed day and it was every man and woman for him and herself, unless you had a job or were an athlete. Everybody else had to queue up in a gigantic mob that started about 4:30 in the morning. And it was one of the most terrifying experiences I'd ever had. I had heard about mobs, but I'd never been in one. We didn't have enough people in Greensboro to make a mob. But that crowd took on a life of its own. And I remember for a while my feet didn't touch the ground as it swayed back and forth. And it was commanded by Dean William Tate with a bullhorn and a clipboard, and he baseball cap, and he whipped us into shape and told us when we could go in, and we all got inside. And you know, if you didn't get there soon enough, the classes closed and you couldn't take what you wanted to take. Fortunately, the things I was taking nobody else wanted. I, for some reason, was taking Greek. I never had any trouble signing up for Dr. Alexander's Greek classes. And I want to talk about Dr. Alexander before we get away from the university.
I want to go back to your discussion of the science complex going up on campus. That would have been around '58, right? Sputnik, the Russians.
Yes.
We were in the midst of Cold War, and it was just, we were just...
That finally shook the money out of the legislature
did.
to finally do something about science.
To break ground up there on Ag Hill and make
things
happen.
You know, the university at that time was still a small, closed-off state university. You know, I don't want to use the term backwater, but most of the faculty had graduated from the university. So it was ingrown and just kind of laid back. And the interesting thing about it was, as the 60s came on, as 58 segued into the early 60s, and Jack Kennedy came along, really created, as you know, a fervor, a sense of changing from the dull Eisenhower years to something new and fresh. And it's funny, you know, all the faculty that I recall in those early years was still wearing their old clothes from the 1940s. At that time, it was wide ties and, you know, coats with shoulder pads. And if you looked in on an academic department, you know, you would think you were in a time warp. And there was a bright young professor in the political science department, Dr. George Parthemus, and he had his degree, his PhD from the University of North Carolina. He'd done some work at Harvard. He'd been in the war, commanded a ship in the Navy, and he was the son of Greek immigrant parents from Abbeville, South Carolina. And you know, he was one of those professors who just really turned us on to the possibilities of politics and government. And we'd sit around his office after class and talk. And you know, he was the only liberal on the campus that we regularly encountered. And he was ahead of the game. He was ahead of the curve. And at that time, it was largely, I would say, a conservative faculty, and so George just stood out and really was just kind of pointed us forward to the way things could become.
Ask not what you can do for your country, and that was back to President Kennedy and all that he. You're right. Yeah. Dramatic changes, and that was something I'm going to talk to you later about, is when you were back on campus teaching and the kinds of changes that were coming. But
and I mentioned Dr. Alexander. I had considered studying for the ministry, and so was one reason I signed up for Greek as a language. But I also just had a kind of underlying sense that a person should get a basic classical education. It turns out I was a terrible Greek scholar, but Dr. Alexander was a wonderful, beautifully educated a man from, who came from Jefferson, just right up the road in Jefferson, Georgia, but he was the Greek ideal. He was in the Army, he was in the Army Reserves, and yet he loved music and he loved poetry, and he would quote Greek to us and remind us that, we could be conjugating verbs while we brushed our teeth, just to concentrate on it. And he was just he was so beautifully educated that just in himself he was an inspiration to show you what you could become. I never became that, but he was a wonderful scholar and teacher.
Both of those gentlemen I knew, and what gentlemen scholars they were too.
Indeed, yeah.
Is there anybody else you'd like to talk about that was a memorable faculty or staff person from that time?
Well, Dr. Collins, Morris Collins, was another of my mentors, mainly in work that I did at the Institute of Government. He got me to, Dr. Parthemus, in fact, recommended me to Dr. Collins to work on an early study of the governmental background that put MARTA together in Atlanta. And then later, as we'll talk about, I worked for Dr. Collins at the Institute of Government after I graduated. But
you mentioned that you lived in Reed Hall your freshman year.
Mm-hmm.
Where else?
Well, I, after my freshman year, joined Phi Delta Theta social fraternity and lived in that house for a couple of years, and then later had an apartment house in 5 Points on Castalia Avenue.
We're going to talk about the Greek system here in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Your academic major was political science. Is that
It was political science. I noticed that on that form you showed me earlier, I had put it down as history. I had taken a lot of history and a lot of political science, and finally, when it came time to graduate, I added them all up and had more political science than history, so I was a political science major.
Did you have, at that time, you had decided against the ministry? You decided you'd go in another direction?
It still was an option, and in fact, when I graduated, I got both a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship and a Rockefeller Fellowship, Rockefeller being to study theology and Woodrow Wilson for graduate school, and I went to graduate school and never went back. We didn't have a campus bus system.
Oh gosh, no.
The campus wasn't as large, but still you could have a class in academic building and then one on South Campus after that, and you had to hoof it down, and then we didn't even have the bridge.
No bridge.
You had to climb those steps. So that was tremendous, and students would hitchhike. If you went down Lumpkin Street, there would be waves of students out in the street trying to catch a ride over to the South Campus, and only the girls got rides. It was hopeless.
That wasn't fair.
No, there were, guys would stop and load their car up with girls and head on.
Leave you standing there.
You can't, but there's no way that could happen today.
No.
But it was in lieu of a bus system, and of course there were 3 places to eat downtown. There was Tony's Restaurant and the Snack Shack and the Varsity, and then there was Posse's Barbecue out on the Atlanta Highway and Harry's Drive-In in 5 Points.
That's about it.
And that was about it.
And girls couldn't go into the Varsity.
No.
You had to send somebody in, bring you your hot dog.
Isn't that amazing?
And the Snack Shack had the best icebox lemon pie in the world.
I remember the country fried steak. I don't remember the, but.
And Posse's had a steak that was, it was not steak quality, but it was what you got when you went. Can't remember.
Well, also there was a Campus Hideaway, which was on down past what's now the 5 Points liquor store, which used to be Harry's.
Mm-hmm.
So a little further down Lumpkin was a Campus Hideaway, which was the first place I ever encountered pizza. And you know, they had red check tablecloths and candles in Chianti bottles, and a guy in the corner playing classical guitar.
Very sophisticated.
This was actually before I came to the university. I came over once with my high school girlfriend, Kay Dalvin, and we had never had pizza before, so we ordered pizza, and the waitress asked Kay what she would like to drink, and she said, buttermilk. So that's the only time
very sophisticated.
That's really sophisticated, pizza and buttermilk.
You didn't just attend class, you jumped into college with both feet. You were involved across campus, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I thought if I weren't going to be a minister, that maybe I'd be governor of Georgia, so I figured I'd better participate in some things.
And you were involved in student government. Eventually you were vice president of the student body in 1961.
I was.
Talk about how student government worked at that time, in that era. Campaigns, and then... And then...
Yeah, you know, we didn't have much to do, really. I mean, we met and decided where the students should sit in the stadium and things like that. But
so if we ask about the power of the student government, it had to do with stadium seating and...
Yeah, as I recall, there wasn't much real power. I did notice, though, when, I guess we'll talk about when the university, when integration came to the university, it came in handy to be able to speak as the vice president of the student council, even though most of the student council didn't agree with me. So I saw the value of having some kind of title to put after your name.
How did you, as I recall, there were the different campaigns, different groups sort of coalesced behind one candidate, and there was some campaigning out in the dorms and Greek houses and those kind of things. Was that your experience? Did you have to do any, or did... Basically,
as I recall, the two parties on campus were the Greeks and the non-Greeks.
Right.
And I suppose at that time the Greeks had the balance of power.
Maybe primarily because they had some mechanism by which everybody was together and they could suggest how you go, whereas the independents were sort of spread out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about, we're going to talk about desegregation in just a minute, but talk about Greek life. You lived in the Fidel house.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I had this ideal of a close-knit band of brothers with a lot in common, but you know, at that time, the fraternities were so large. I mean, it was over 100 people, and you couldn't possibly be friends with all of them. You barely know some of them, and you know, I've often wondered why I did that. My father wanted me to, and I knew that it would be a socializing influence, and I tended to be sort of introverted. So in that sense, it forced me to interact with a lot of different people constantly, all the time. And I did make a few really good friends who are still friends today because we were thrown together in the fraternity. But, you know, I can't say particularly because of the trajectory of my life that having been a Greek had any particular influence on it. You know, when I was in New York City, it didn't matter whether I was a Fidel or...
It might have mattered in Atlanta, Georgia.
That's what, yes, of course.
Interesting. You also participated in the Wesley Foundation, as you had mentioned earlier. There's the Methodist Student Center.
Mm-hmm.
And there's mention of a Religion and Life Committee.
Yeah.
Will you tell us what that was?
Well, I'm not sure what the Religion and Life Committee was. I can't remember whether that was just, you know, one of those organizations that planned some religious emphases, but I'm confusing it with the what went on at Westminster House with Corky King and the Presbyterian ministers. That was a tremendously significant part of my college years. And you want to talk about that now?
I do. That'd be great. Unless you think it better falls under, why don't we talk about the beginnings of the desegregation situation,
okay,
and then move to that?
Yeah.
As we said, the times were a-changing, and certainly on schools and campuses. Talk about what you observed and what your reactions were as a student during that time period in early 1961, when actually Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes had come to campus.
Right.
Also, if you would, tell us, as a student government officer, were you did you have any special role in this, or were you asked for your help or your reaction, or?
Not particularly as a student council officer, but you know, as we saw the integration coming on and observed, as everybody in the state did, the various legal machinations to try to prevent their entry into the university and their own lawyers' efforts to accomplish that. And you know, we sat in on the court hearings in which we watched our university officials, from the president on down, deny that there was racial segregation at the University of Georgia. And it was a rather disillusioning period to see our officials swear under oath that there was no concerted effort or mechanism to keep black students out of the university. But then when the efforts of the federal courts, Judge Tuttle and Judge Boodle, resulted in the order that they be admitted forthwith for the beginning of the winter quarter in 1961. When they came to campus, there was a tremendous, as you know, outcry against it, in mobs and flags and people aping for the cameras that were delighted to get pictures of typical Georgia students. And a group of us, some on the student council, others in other organizations, were concerned that the university not project that attitude or that vision to the world, because there are a lot of people here who were not opposed to their coming to school. And so we decided to get up a petition. And of course, at that time, there was a very real chance that the University of Georgia would be closed, because the law read that it would be closed if black students were admitted. So in the course of a weekend, we got up a petition, over 3,000 signatures as I recall. I may be exaggerating in hindsight, but a very large and impressive number. And the petition simply read, would you prefer, if it came down to it, should the university remain open or should it close if the black students are admitted? And overwhelmingly, the people who signed the petition said it should stay open no matter what. And we took that over and presented it to the Speaker of the House, Fred Hand in Atlanta, who, although a segregationist, was opposed to closing the university. And finally, the university was kept open, but of course, meanwhile, we had the riot at Myers Hall after, you know, God, talk about mob scenes. That was horrible.
Were you there?
I was there, and the mob was across Lumpkin from Myers Hall, shouting and throwing rocks, and the police had loosed some tear gas, so we all had tear gas in our eyes and were getting hit by the rocks that they were throwing. And you know, Dean Tate was there as usual. Dean Tate was of course a genuine hero of that period, because I don't know what his own beliefs were about whether or not Hamilton and Charlene should have been there, but his duty as Dean of Men, whether he was Dean of Men or Dean of Students by then, I'm not sure, but was to protect them, and he did, and he went everywhere with them, and a number of courageous students also went with them, and you know, he stayed with them until it was no longer necessary. And I remember just marveling at, I was downtown one night in front of the arch where a group of students had gathered, and they were getting angry, and they had flags, and they wanted to march to Myers Hall. And all of a sudden, Dean Tate just appeared in their midst, and he accosted one young man and said, "What's your name, boy?" And he said, "Dean Tate, it's Billy so-and-so." And he said, "Where are you from?" He said, I'm from Cartersville." He said, "Your daddy so-and-so?" And he said, "Yes, sir, Dean Tate." He said, "Well, I knew him here. He know you out here tonight?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, Dean Tate. I think I better be getting on to the library." You know, and it went from an angry mob to just a bunch of boys laughing and jostling with Dean Tate. And it was just amazing to see him do something like that. He
worked magic sometime, didn't he?
Yeah.
I had heard that there were a group of women who were in the women's student government who were asked to walk with Charlene, and that they had, and you were right, I think those were courageous people and people who had strong beliefs that. Right,
yeah,
that
people like John Zitzelman, for instance.
Fairness.
Yeah.
So, would you say it's the most momentous thing that ever happened in your memory on campus? Was integration, desegregation?
Sure, it would have to be that. Yeah, it was a real sea change, a real
world turned upside down.
Mm-hmm. And you know, it's one of those things that, of course, in retrospect, you realize, you remember how difficult it was and how impossible it seemed, and how incredulous people were that two black students were going to be in our university. And you know, it was not that momentous. I mean, it should have happened a long time ago. And since then, of course, we still have a limited number of African American students at the university for various reasons, but their right to be there is not questioned legally.
What of your 4 years, and this may be asking you the same question I just asked, what stands out in your mind of your 4 years as a student here as the most meaningful memory that you have?
Well, I think I would have to say that, you know, even at that time, the university probably didn't have that good an academic reputation. It was not until later that the legislature was finally convinced that in order to have a first-class university, it was going to take money. So in that sense, it was still sort of a backwater school, but even then, I saw that if you wanted to find a good education, it was there. And there were enough good teachers and enough good courses that you could really cobble together a good education, and a lot of people did. Toward the end of my time at the university, hung out with some really bright students, and they were a challenge to me and made me work harder, but I saw them, and you know, they all went on to get Rhodes Scholarships, Fulbrights, Woodrow Wilson, and they, you know, they could match students from anywhere. So it was there if you wanted it. You just, maybe you had to work a little harder than if you were at Duke or Davidson, but it was there, and I'm sure it's the same now, even more. When I was a junior, they came up with the idea of freshman camp, which was to be a week of orienting the top pick of freshman students to the traditions and the possibilities of the University of Georgia. And it was over at Rock Eagle outside Eatonton. And I was chosen among a lot of other folks to be a counselor. And we had a great time. It was a lot of fun. We put on skits, and I don't remember what all we did, but it was a good time, you know, with the bright incoming freshmen and us counselors. But I met my future wife there, Gay Griggs from Hartwell, and about 17 years later we got married, but we first met there and knew each other while she was in school, and I guess I was in graduate school back here from time to time, but we stayed in touch. And so the University of Georgia brought me my present wife of long standing.
It did impact you in a number of ways.
Yes.
You graduated in '62. Did you go straight on to graduate school at that time?
I did. Mm-hmm.
And you went to the School of Public Law and Government at Columbia University in New York City.
Yes.
What was life like at Columbia in the early '60s?
Well, it was a big, somewhat impersonal place, and I certainly had no business being in graduate school. That was over my head. I mean, I hung around for a long time, but not to much avail. I learned a lot, and I learned a lot in New York City. I loved being in New York City. But graduate study was not my forte, I should say.
You mentioned New York. Did you get a different perspective on the world after living in New York City for a while?
I guess surely I did to some extent, but you know, I felt more at home in New York than I ever have anywhere. There's just so much there, and I suppose it probably has to do with when you're growing up and going to the movies, you know, every other movie is set in New York, so when you get to New York, it seems like a familiar place. And of course, the New York of the 1960s was still much more of a collection of villages and neighborhoods, and it had not, by any means, at that point, it was, of course, I'm sure it was expensive compared to Athens, but it wasn't what it is now. I mean, you could still find a cheap apartment in the village, and if you knew how, you could eat without spending a lot of money, and you could get around easily. So it was really a good place to live for a young person trying to figure out what was going on.
And there was a lot going on.
Yes.
Always.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great city. Now, did you come back to Athens after that, and how did you get back to teaching?
Well, I got married and decided that I needed a job.
Needed to make a living.
Yes, and I could come back to work at the Institute of Government. Dr. Collins, for whom I had done some research earlier, would offer me a job. And my wife at that time, Chatham Murray, wanted to get a master's degree in art. So we moved back to Athens, and she went to art school, and I worked at the Institute of Government.
What'd you do there?
Well, I was in the state government section, so I did projects having to do with the Georgia legislature.
What an experience. What an experience.
Well, it
Georgia
was, and
legislature.
you know, the interesting thing about that particular time at the Institute of Government was that when Carl Sanders was governor from '62 to '66, he did a lot for the university. He did a lot for the law school, and he understood the necessity for money to have a first-class school. And so the university was very much on Carl's side. And when he ran again, the university was again on Carl's side, but Carl didn't win. Jimmy Carter won. And Jimmy Carter was a tech man, and he didn't care much about the University of Georgia compared to Carl Sanders, and particularly because people like Dr. Collins had been so close to Carl, and I guess the president also. But so Dr. Collins and the Institute set out to prove to Governor Carter how much we wanted to help him. And so there was he was trying to reform state government and streamline the Georgia legislature. So Dr. Collins sold him on the idea of having the Institute of Government act as consultants on that project, which we did. And so we had a show and tell session with Governor Carter once that and when it came my time to tell him how I thought the state should be organized, I was holding forth, and I noticed that he wasn't really looking me in the eye. And I was living out in the woods at the time, walking in the woods with my beagle dog. But anyway, I finally realized there was a tick crawling down my forehead that had captured the governor's attention. So whatever I told him, I don't think was enacted into state government, except maybe tick eradication.
Well, now at some point, you were teaching political science, were you not?
I was, yes.
Was that at the same time you were at the Institute of Government, or was that at a later point?
Well, let me back up. Let's see. I taught a couple of summers, thanks to Dr. Parthemus, while I was in graduate school. And then after we came back, I believe the first year we were back, I did work in the political science department. I taught and advised undergraduates. That's right. It was the next year that I went to the Institute of Government, yeah.
I was going to ask you, when you returned south, and were back in the classroom, and that would have been mid to late 60s, things were really beginning to rock and roll, and there was beginning to be a real questioning of the traditional ways of life. We had everything from the civil rights era. We were beginning to look at Vietnam, and student rights were starting to be an issue. What did you see from your students during that time? Was there were there conversations at that early point, or?
Yes, it's interesting. When we came back here in 1968, there was a real academic fervor on the campus. It was just markedly different from the way it was when we left. And as you recall, it was in 1967 that the legislature finally was convinced to pour money into the university to build up a really good university. And, you know, oddly enough, as I recall, the man who lobbied that through the legislature was the Vice Chancellor, Fred Davison. And so when when the legislature committed all this money to the legislature, when the legislature committed all this money to the university, they wanted to be sure that that money didn't fall into the hands of academics. And so it turned out that they hired Fred Davison, not through the Board of Regents, of course, but Fred Davison became the president, succeeding Dr. Adderhole. And Fred's mission was to preside over the building up of a first-class university. And he did so in a way that angered a lot of people who felt that the collegial relationships of academia were being transformed into a more corporate, top-down management style. And a lot of people in a lot of departments resented that. And at the same time, the money that went to hire new faculty hired a lot of young faculty from graduate schools like Wisconsin and places outside the South. So when all these young teachers came into Athens, they were opposed to racial segregation. They were opposed to the war in Vietnam, and they therefore were quite unpopular with the older guard in many of the departments. And we had scenes like, say, in the history department where they were basically shut out and run off. And many of those young professors who were viewed as radical didn't last long. And that happened in a number of departments on the campus. So yes, there was a lot of ferment, and there was a lot of pushback too. So it was a tremendously interesting time as far as academics and social change at the university.
Did the word activist become, was it a dirty word?
Among some it was, yeah. You know, particularly because when I first came back here in '68, the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, were active here on the campus, and they were pretty good at raising issues and dramatizing inequities, and they caused a lot of upset among the administrators. I don't know what all they actually accomplished other than to do away with in loco parentis and got women to wearing shorts, which has succeeded marvelously by now. That's all women wear on the campus.
We're not going to follow that line of questioning, right? I think you're exactly right. I think with the influx of new faculty whose perspectives were different from what had previously been here, probably not only in the old guard faculty, but folks' parents at home.
Oh, of course, yeah.
That there was a tremendous amount of discussion and you know, from those of us who grew up in the South, and you said yes ma'am and yes sir, till the time that you were marching against the Vietnam War or women's rights. You know, it was a stark, dramatic change, I think.
And here's an interesting episode, which you'll recall. At the time that the high-rise dorms were built on Baxter, Cresswell, and of course Bolton.
Brumby and Cresswell and
Brumby,
Russell.
Right. They, the university housing department, the administration was concerned about the effect of those high-rise anonymous buildings removed from the campus on the residents, on the students. And so they put in place a rather forward-looking program to have student counselors living in the dorms, to have faculty living in the dorms and teaching some classes in the dorms. And it was an attempt to move the university toward the dorms rather than just having students living in anonymous ennui removed from the campus. And it became a rather prestigious program that was studied by other schools all over the country. And it seemed to be working. But part of it was, one of the dorms at least was a co-ed dorm on different floors. There were men and women, not on the same floors. But came that day when a South Georgia lawyer came up to see his daughter and encountered men in the hall, and he was scandalized, and he raised hell and was brought to the attention of the legislature that there were men and women in the same buildings at the University of Georgia. And so it created quite a stink, and the university began to back off from those innovative programs. And along about that time, I was at the Institute of Government, and also active in a house church that was involved in social action. And I knew a lot of the kids who had worked in the dorms as counselors, and some were elected student senators in that period's version of student government. So they were frustrated because they were trying to intervene with the administration and get them not to dismantle these programs. But President Davison would not speak with them about it, and so they determined that they would have a sit-in and would sit in his office until he agreed to speak with them. And being the conscientious liberal that I was, I thought that they should have some faculty support. So on the appointed morning, I went over to the president's office and stood with the students, and we all were quickly arrested for charged with criminal trespass, and tried. And the first trial resulted in a hung jury. The jury had never seen such noble students. But the university tried us again, and by gosh, we were convicted of criminal trespass and fined and put on probation, and I lost my job at the Institute of Government. So, but it was an interesting time, and a lot of that came out of a Presbyterian church, house church, that was trying to direct political action in a number of forms. That started my newspaper career. We put out the United Free Press, mimeographed screed that we just inflicted on the community every few weeks. But got to know just a tremendous amount of really great people that many of whom I still know.
This makes me want to go back and have you discuss the Westminster.
Yeah, I'm glad to get back to that.
Let's go back, because we've had Joan Zitzelman and Winston Stevens both have talked with us, and what an interesting and amazing.
It was, and no doubt they mentioned that we back in the fall or spring, back in the spring, had a 50-year reunion of that group, and you know that was the same impetus. The Presbyterian Church sent a guy named, I'm having a moment, I want to say Bill, what was his last name? He just recently died. He was here for the reunion. It'll come to me in a minute. But they sent him down to build what then was called Westminster House. It's now, I just think, the Presbyterian Student Fellowship. But he came here from Indiana, Wisconsin. He had no concept of racial segregation. He treated everybody alike, and it didn't occur to him that you couldn't do that. And so all of a sudden he was in Athens, Georgia, traveling around the state raising money for a Presbyterian center, and you know, he was just such an unusual man who without guile. He went about doing what he had to do, and he lasted maybe 2 years. And I did not know him at the time. By the time I got involved in Westminster House, it had already been built, and a man named Corky King was here who had succeeded Bill. And so Corky was here during the integration of the university, and he sort of made Westminster a kind of safe house where people could go who were concerned about what was happening on campus from either side. But most of us who went there were sad about the rioting and resistance to these people being admitted to the university. And so Corky was a real steadying influence on a lot of us, and that evolved into a program of studying theology and meeting every morning for what we call the disciplined community, for short worship service early in the morning. And if anybody in the group didn't come, then we didn't have it. So it was dependent on everybody to get there. My memory is that we didn't have it more than we had it, but
early in the morning. That sounds right.
Yeah, but that too was just a wonderful, bright, committed group of people who are still friends. And then Corky didn't last long either, because those ministers were sent here by the National Presbyterian Church, and the local Presbyterian Church wasn't ready for that. And I'm sure Winston told the story of Harold Black, who was maybe the third black student here, just retired as a professor of economics. And Harold found a home at Westminster House, and finally the students who were going to church, which meant going to First Presbyterian, just insisted that he come along with them, and he did, and he was asked to leave, and so soon Corky was asked to leave and was replaced by a man named Roland Perdue, also a wonderful Presbyterian minister who was here for the reunion last spring. And Roland didn't last long either, but those men, Bill, Corky, Roland, and eventually Milner Ball, who had been a Presbyterian preacher and then went to Rutgers and became a lawyer and then a law professor here at the university. But Milner didn't last long either. I mean, it was just an amazing string of bright, liberal Presbyterian ministers who were not supported by the local Presbyterian church. But, again, even though you might call the University of Georgia, even at that time, overall conservative school, it's just an example of, what stimulation was available if you found it. And I don't remember much about Corky's courses, but I'm told that we were reading Tillich and other theologians, Niebuhr, and discussing them, and a really disciplined look at theology, which of course had an influence on me since I was still considering the ministry.
It is interesting to talk about this with young people today. They have no concept of what things were like at that time.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It finally occurred to me at some point that, that period now is as far away as almost the turn of the 20th century was when we were in school. I mean, it's just amazing how far back it is.
That's right. Sometimes it's kind of takes your breath away. There was a great quote, the story that you just told Pete, there's a great quotation from a letter that Dean Tate wrote you that was in the file, which includes the phrase, "I'm giving Fred Davison the credit of being the founder of the Observer."
Yes.
Just elaborate on that just a little bit. I think you've given us the background for it. But
well, after I lost my job at the Institute of Government, my friend Chuck Searcy, who was one of the students arrested that day, and I started the Athens Observer basically to create jobs for ourselves, but because we were interested in what was going on in the community, and we had been involved in politics, as I said, and activism of various kinds. And so we had a really good grasp of who was who and what was going on. And Chuck had worked during the McGovern campaign down in Albany and had met some people who had a little shopper, just an all advertising newspaper. And he came back here fired up to start a paper. And since neither one of us had jobs, we decided to do it. And it happened to be a good time for something like that because the Vietnam War was winding down, and students were kind of drifting out of school and starting little businesses and hanging around Athens playing music. And there was growing up a kind of alternative community that was receptive to our kind of newspaper, and enough little alternative businesses to provide enough of an advertising base that we could make a go of it. So the Observer caught on and became a popular community newspaper. And Chuck eventually went to Washington with the Carter administration. And when Carter was defeated by Reagan, Chuck noticed that his paycheck stopped coming. He came back to Athens, this time fired up about starting a television station. So we started Observer Television on top of the Athens Observer, and instead of having one money-losing operation, we had two. But we had a lot of fun. And Chuck's idea was we already had a news gathering organization, so we were halfway there, but that news gathering organization didn't have any idea of taking on a television as well as a newspaper.
Where is Chuck now, Pete?
Chuck is in Vietnam. He's been in Vietnam for over 15 years.
Is that right?
He served there in the Army and fell in love with it and went back several times, and then got a job with a veterans organization. And now that has spun off. He's in charge of a group that is removing unexploded ordnance from the countryside, of which there's still a tremendous amount.
Mm. Talk about the flagpole a little bit.
Well, I finally sold my interest in the Observer and realized that I didn't know how to do anything but newspapers, and had various jobs, wrote a couple of bad novels that will never see the light of day, fortunately. And meanwhile, some people had started Flagpole as a kind of alternative to the Observer and to the dailies, and eventually I started doing a little writing for them and got on as editor, and then eventually bought the stock and own it along with my partner Alicia Nichols. And it's more of an arts and entertainment magazine than the Observer was, but it still has a strong political and government interest. And it too, I think, is popular, although people still come up to me and just say, I miss the Observer. I think, why don't you read Flagpole? But I'm delighted to have gotten a second chance in journalism.
well, while we're talking about journalism, comment on the Red and Black going independent back how many years ago?
It was 1980, I think.
20?
Long time,
Gosh,
80
more
to
than
81.
that.
Yeah.
There was a column in the file about, for people who will be seeing this maybe someday, the Red and Black was and is the University of Georgia newspaper, but it became independent 20 or 30 years ago, and was a, although they've had some controversy lately. Talk a little bit about student journalism.
Well, you know, the Red and Black has a proud tradition of student journalism, and many of the journalists in the state, of course, got their start there. Not having studied journalism at the university, I was never involved in the Red and Black. And, you know, their career since going independent, which a lot of university papers did at the time, again, it had to do with that in loco parentis. The university didn't want the legal responsibility for these kids doing journalism.
What they were saying in the paper, or?
Yeah, because before that it was part of the university,
right.
And the university was liable, so they wanted to get out of that, and so they were glad to see the Red and Black go. The Red and Black, as a competitor, I will say, still gets some preferential treatment, just in terms of distribution on the campus and that sort of thing. But I think they do a good job, and you know, I think it remains to be seen now that they have gone from being a daily or a 5-day daily to a once a week, back to a weekly, with their emphasis online with their daily journalism. That's just proven to be a hard road to hoe for everybody. Newsweek on down, for the New York Times. Everybody's still trying to figure out how to monetize their online offerings. To some extent, it doesn't affect us that much because we're a free circulation paper anyway, so being free on the web is natural to us.
I think I've already asked this question, but from your point of view, what was the most momentous? What have been the most momentous changes on campus over the last half century? How does that feel?
Oh my God!
And I think we've already indicated that certainly desegregation was probably the most earth-shaking change.
Yeah, and then you know, I mean, also just in terms of the university, the quality of the university has, I do believe, has risen markedly, and you know, it's a serious university now compared to what it was 50 years ago, and I'm not capable of really of judging it, and of course the Hope Scholarship. You know, they almost immediately took away the aspect of it that helped needy students and gave it to everybody. So it seems to have had the effect of improving the quality of the students, but not the diversity. And because the better schools are in the Atlanta area, it has brought a lot of students here who have taken the place of when we were there 50 years ago. You know, there were kids from all over Georgia. A lot of it reflected the state of Georgia, white state of Georgia, more than I think it does now. I think it reflects the North Georgia, Atlanta, Cobb County.
I think that would be the case.
Yeah.
I think that's true. But of course, a lot of those folks from Cobb County and didn't grow up, aren't Georgia folks.
True.
One of the things that you will hear some of these demographers, does that sound right? Talk about is that you know, these are folks from Wisconsin and
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it
New
that
York
way.
who've moved, and Texas, who have moved into the Atlanta area, and that's interesting. What are your fondest memories of the University of Georgia?
I guess really that period with Corky and them, that was such an intense period where there was so much going on, and we did feel that we were making a difference at the university. And you know, just to be with like-minded people who were trying to accomplish something and working hard at it and taking some risk at doing it, to me that was the best part of my years at the university.